December 13th, 1943, 9:27 a.m. Northeast India. The first burst of machine gun fire ripped through the morning sky like thunder from hell itself. 6 .50 caliber rounds punched through the engine cowling of a Japanese bomber, and orange flames erupted from its left wing in a violent explosion that painted the clouds with fire and smoke. Metal fragments scattered across the formation. Pilots screamed into their radios. And somewhere in the chaos, one American fighter dove through 75 enemy aircraft, like a man who had already decided that death was not on his schedule today. His name was Philip Adair, 23 years old. Former farm boy from Kansas who used to fix tractors before the war, turned him into something else entirely. Before this morning, nobody in the United States Army Air Forces had ever heard of him. After this morning, Japanese commanders would spend weeks trying to figure out how one pilot could destroy an entire mission. Here is the number that makes military historians lose sleep. 1 American fighter versus 75 Japanese aircraft. 30 bombers loaded with enough explosives to turn an entire airfield into a crater. 45 escort fighters designed specifically to destroy anything that dared to challenge them. The standard engagement ratio that pilots were taught to never exceed was 5-1. Philip Adair was facing 75-1, and he won. But to understand how a single man in an obsolete airplane could change the course of a battle, you need to understand what the world looked like in the winter of 1943. Because this story does not begin with heroism. It begins with disaster. 8 weeks before Philip Adair became a legend, the skies over Burma and Northeast India belonged to Japan. Their strategy was brutally simple. Strike at dawn. Hit the airfields before anyone could react. Destroy everything on the ground. The Allied forces called it the Nightmare Hour, because that is exactly what it was. Pilots would wake up to the sound of explosions instead of alarm clocks. Ground crews would run toward their aircraft only to watch them burn. On one particularly devastating morning in October, Japanese bombers caught an American transport hub completely unprepared. 47C. 47 transport planes were destroyed in less than 20 minutes. 112 men died before they could even reach their defensive positions. Most of them were mechanics, medics, and supply clerks who had never fired a weapon in combat. The attack was so successful that Japanese intelligence began planning larger raids across the entire China-Burma-India theater. The target they selected next was Dinjan Airfield, and this is where the math becomes terrifying. Dinjan was not just another runway in the jungle. It was the lifeline that kept China in the war. Every day, hundreds of transport planes would take off from Dinjan and fly over the Himalayan mountains to deliver supplies to Chiang Kai-shek's forces. The route was called the Hump, and it was the most dangerous cargo run in human history. Pilots faced storms, mechanical failures, enemy fighters, and mountains that could swallow an airplane whole. But they kept flying because without those supplies, China would collapse. And if China collapsed, Japan would control the entire Pacific. The morning of December 13th, 14 fully loaded C-47 transports sat on the tarmac at Dinjan. Fuel depots surrounded the runway like a ring of waiting bonfires. A field hospital housed 73 wounded soldiers who could not be moved. If the Japanese bombers reached their target, the Hump airlift would shut down for weeks, perhaps months. The consequences would ripple across the entire war. Japanese commanders knew all of this. That is why they sent everything they had. 75 aircraft launched from bases in Burma before sunrise. 30 Mitsubishi Ki-21 heavy bombers carried enough ordnance to crater every runway and ignite every fuel tank at Dinjan. 45 Nakajima Ki-43. Oscar fighters provided escort flying above and below the bomber formation, like wolves protecting their pack. Intelligence reports indicated that American defenses in the region were minimal. Radar coverage was almost non-existent. The element of surprise was absolute. By 9:15 a.m., the formation was 17 minutes from Dinjan. No alarm had been raised, no fighters had scrambled. Victory seemed inevitable. But nobody had accounted for Philip Adair. Here is where the story becomes something that should not exist outside of fiction. Adair was not supposed to be in the air that morning. His squadron had been scheduled for a patrol 2 hours later. But Adair had developed a habit that his commanding officers found irritating and his mechanic found exhausting. He woke up before dawn every single day and took his P-40 Warhawk up for what he called morning exercises. Other pilots slept in. Adair flew. On December 13th, he was 15 miles north of Dinjan when the sun caught something metallic in the distance. He banked his aircraft toward the glint and immediately felt his stomach drop. The sky was full of aircraft. More aircraft than he had ever seen outside of a training film. The formation stretched across the horizon like a swarm of locusts heading directly for his airfield. Adair counted quickly. 30 bombers, at least 40 fighters, maybe more. The numbers were impossible. Standard military doctrine for a situation like this was very clear. Do not engage. Shadow the enemy. Radio their position. Wait for reinforcements. Under no circumstances should a single pilot attack a formation this size. It would be suicide. It would accomplish nothing. It would be, in the words of every flight manual ever written, insane. Adair checked his fuel gauge. Full tanks. 90 minutes of flight time. He checked his ammunition. Loaded. 1,800 rounds across 6 machine guns. Enough firepower for roughly 12 seconds of sustained fire if he held the trigger down. 12 seconds against 75 aircraft. He checked his radio and called Dinjan Tower. The response was static and confusion. No one was ready. No fighters were in the air. The nearest friendly aircraft were 38 minutes away. By then, the airfield would be a smoking ruin. Philip Adair had 12 seconds of ammunition and 0 good options, so he made a decision that no military strategist would ever recommend. He pushed the throttle forward and pointed his nose directly at the enemy formation. Because if you are going to die anyway, you might as well make it count for something. The P-40 Warhawk was not a glamorous aircraft. By 1943, pilots considered it outdated, underpowered, and outclassed by nearly every Japanese fighter in the theater. It could not climb fast enough. It could not turn tight enough. Most squadrons were desperate to trade their P-40s for anything newer. But the Warhawk had one advantage that Philip Adair was about to exploit with brutal effectiveness. It was heavy. It was tough. And in a dive, it could reach speeds that Japanese fighters could not match. Adair climbed to 4,000 feet above the bomber formation. The Japanese aircraft droned along calmly, completely unaware that death was circling overhead. Their formation was perfect. Their confidence was complete. They were already thinking about the mission debriefing. Then Adair rolled his aircraft onto its back and dove. The P-40 fell out of the sky like a meteor with machine guns. Speed built rapidly. 300 miles per hour. 350. The engine screamed. The wind tore at the airframe. Below him, the lead bomber grew larger in his windscreen. At 800 yards, Adair squeezed the trigger. 6 machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The cockpit shook violently as hundreds of .50 caliber rounds streaked toward the target. Tracers stitched across the lead bomber's wing, tearing through fabric and metal. The left engine exploded in a ball of orange fire. The aircraft immediately lost control and began spiraling toward the jungle below. The formation shattered. Bombers scattered in every direction. Pilots yanked their controls in panic. 45 escort fighters suddenly realized that they had a problem. A serious problem. An American problem that had just appeared out of nowhere and ruined their entire carefully planned mission. Adair pulled up hard, absorbing 7 Gs as he climbed away from the chaos. Behind him, the Japanese fighters scrambled to respond. But they were confused. They were disorganized. And they were about to learn that Philip Adair was just getting started. He dove again. Another bomber exploded. He climbed. He dove. He fired. Each pass lasted seconds. Each pass left destruction in its wake. The Oscars chased him, but every time they got close, Adair would dive away at speeds their lighter aircraft could not match. He was using his airplane's weight as a weapon, converting gravity into survival. But here is what the Japanese pilots did not understand. What they could not understand. Philip Adair was not trying to shoot down every aircraft in the formation. He was trying to break their formation. He was trying to scatter them. He was trying to make them so confused and terrified that they would abandon the mission entirely. And it was working. By 9:41 a.m., 14 minutes after the engagement began, every single Japanese bomber had turned away from Dinjan. Not one bomb had been dropped. The airfield remained completely intact. 14 transport planes sat safely on the tarmac. The field hospital never heard a single explosion. The hump airlift would continue without interruption. One pilot, 12 seconds of ammunition, 75 enemy aircraft turned back. But Philip Adair's morning was far from over, because now he had to get home, and his airplane was dying. The engine temperature gauge had passed the red line 8 minutes ago. Coolant leaked from a dozen bullet holes. Oil pressure was dropping fast. Smoke began seeping into the cockpit. The P-40 had done something miraculous, but machines have limits, and this machine had reached its breaking point. Adair turned toward Nguli Airfield, 40 miles away. Behind him, 6 Japanese fighters followed like sharks tracking blood in the water. They knew his airplane was damaged. They knew he could not fight back. They circled above him, waiting for the moment when his engine would finally give up. What happened next would become one of the most incredible pieces of aviation survival ever recorded. Because Philip Adair was about to discover that when everything fails, sometimes the only option left is to do something that no pilot has ever done before. His engine was dying, his controls were damaged, his ammunition was gone, and 40 miles of jungle waited below like an open grave. But Philip Adair was not ready to die. Not today. Not like this. In Part 2, we will witness the impossible flight home. How a farm boy from Kansas flew an airplane upside down for 11 minutes, landed a burning aircraft with no working controls, and walked away from a wreck that should have killed him 3 times over. The Japanese thought they had escaped a squadron of American fighters. They were wrong. They had escaped one man, and that man was about to become a legend. 14 minutes. That is how long it took Philip Adair to turn 75 Japanese aircraft into a confused, scattered mess, retreating toward Burma. One pilot. One obsolete P-40 Warhawk. 12 seconds of ammunition. Every bomber turned back. Not a single bomb touched Dinjan Airfield. The field hospital remained standing. The hump airlift continued without interruption. But the mission was only half finished, because now Philip Adair had to survive, and his airplane was dying. The Allison 5-1710 engine had been designed to run at full military power for exactly 5 minutes. Adair had pushed it for 11 straight minutes at maximum throttle, diving and climbing through a formation of enemy aircraft while bullets punched holes through his fuselage. The temperature gauge had passed the danger zone 8 minutes ago. Now the needle sat firmly in territory that engineers labeled with a simple warning: catastrophic failure imminent. Coolant sprayed from 7 bullet holes in the engine cowling. Oil pressure dropped from 60 pounds to 40, then 30, then 20. The kind of numbers that meant pistons were about to seize. Connecting rods were about to snap. The entire power plant was about to transform from a functioning engine into 2,000 pounds of useless metal. Smoke began seeping into the cockpit. Thin at first, then thick enough to burn his eyes. Philip Adair was 40 miles from the nearest friendly airfield with an engine that had maybe 5 minutes left to live. 6 Japanese Oscar fighters circled above him like vultures waiting for a wounded animal to collapse. Here is what standard emergency procedure dictated. Bail out. Let the airplane crash into the jungle. Deploy your parachute and hope friendly forces find you before the enemy does. The manual was very clear about this situation. When your engine is on fire and your controls are damaged and enemy fighters are tracking you, the airplane is already lost. Save yourself. Philip Adair looked at the bailout handle. He looked at the jungle below. Then he looked at the instrument panel, where the temperature needle had literally begun to melt from the heat radiating through the firewall. He did not pull the bailout handle. Instead, he did something that would later make aviation engineers question whether they understood physics at all. He decided to fly home anyway. The first problem was simple. The engine was overheating because he had been running at maximum power for too long. The solution was equally simple. Reduce power. But reducing power meant losing speed. Losing speed meant the Oscar fighters behind him would catch up. Getting caught by 6 enemy fighters with no ammunition was not a survival strategy. Adair found the razor edge between life and death. He reduced throttle just enough to keep the engine temperature from climbing higher while maintaining just enough speed to stay ahead of his pursuers. The margin for error was approximately 0. Too much power and the engine would seize. Too little power and the Oscars would close the distance and finish him. For 12 agonizing minutes, he flew that impossible line. Then the engine caught fire. Not the gentle smoke he had been dealing with. Real fire. Flames licked out from beneath the cowling and streaked past his canopy. The cockpit temperature spiked. The smell of burning oil and melting rubber filled the air. His eyes watered. His lungs burned. Carbon monoxide began seeping into his bloodstream with every breath. The P-40 had approximately 90 seconds before the fire reached the fuel tanks. When that happened, the airplane would not crash. It would explode. Adair had one option left. He shoved the nose down and dove toward the jungle below. Speed increased. 400 miles per hour. 420. The wind screaming past the canopy actually helped. The increased airflow pushed the flames backward away from the fuel tanks and partially suffocated the fire. He was literally outrunning his own death. But diving meant losing altitude, and altitude was the only thing keeping him ahead of those Oscar fighters. At 8,000 feet, the Japanese pilots realized what was happening. The American's engine was failing. His aircraft was on fire. He was going down. They pushed their throttles forward and dove after him. At 6,000 feet, the fire reduced to heavy smoke. The engine was still running somehow. Damaged, dying, but running. The Allison engineers would later examine what remained of that power plant and declare it medically impossible that it continued functioning. The crankshaft was warped. 3 pistons had partially seized. The oil pump had failed completely, yet the propeller kept turning. At 4,000 feet, the controls went soft. This is the moment when most pilots would have accepted their fate. When the control cables are damaged and the airplane stops responding to your inputs, you are no longer flying. You are a passenger in a metal coffin falling toward Earth. But Philip Adair was not most pilots. He felt the stick go loose in his right hand. The elevator cables had been cut by enemy fire. The airplane began pitching nose down toward the jungle below. He pulled back on the stick. Nothing happened. The nose continued dropping. Speed increased. Trees rushed toward him with terrifying speed. Philip Adair had maybe 8 seconds to solve a problem that had killed hundreds of pilots before him. And in those 8 seconds, his brain performed a calculation that should not have been possible under stress and carbon monoxide poisoning and G-forces. If the damaged controls were forcing him down when he was right side up, what would happen if he flipped the airplane upside down? Aerodynamics does not care about orientation. Lift is lift, drag is drag. The forces that were killing him might save him if he simply reversed the equation. At 1,800 feet above the jungle canopy, Philip Adair rolled the P-40 Warhawk completely inverted and began flying upside down. Blood rushed to his head. His vision went red, then gray around the edges. Negative G-forces pressed him upward against his restraints. Fuel flow became erratic because the engine was designed to operate right side up. The carburetor sputtered. The propeller coughed. But the nose came up. The descent stopped. He was climbing. Upside down. In a burning airplane with no functioning elevator controls and 6 enemy fighters watching him from above. The Oscar pilots saw what was happening, and they did something that Japanese military culture almost never permitted. They hesitated. Whatever this American was doing defied everything they understood about aviation. No pilot flew inverted on purpose with a damaged aircraft. No pilot climbed upside down toward enemy fighters. No pilot should have been alive at all after what they had witnessed. The formation leader made a decision. He turned his flight away from the American and headed back toward Burma. Whatever madness was happening in that P-40 cockpit, his pilots wanted no part of it. They had witnessed something that felt less like combat and more like watching a man argue with death itself. Philip Adair barely noticed them leave. He was too busy trying not to pass out. Flying inverted solves one problem while creating several others. The human body is not designed for sustained negative G-forces. Blood pools in the head. Vision deteriorates. Consciousness fades. The engine also suffers because gravity no longer helps fuel flow into the carburetor. Adair had maybe 90 seconds of inverted flight before his body or his engine would fail. So he developed a technique that no flight manual has ever documented. He would fly upside down until his vision began tunneling. Then he would roll the aircraft right side up just long enough for blood to drain from his head and fuel to flow properly into the engine. Then, the damaged controls would start forcing him down again. Then he would roll inverted again. Flip, climb, flip, descend, flip, climb, flip, descend. For 11 minutes, Philip Adair flew toward Ngully Airfield, using a technique he invented on the spot while his airplane burned around him. Ground observers later reported seeing a P-40 approaching the field in a series of bizarre rolling maneuvers that looked like a wounded bird trying to stay airborne through pure stubbornness. They were not entirely wrong. The runway appeared on the horizon, 7 miles away, then 5, then 3. Adair had one final problem to solve. Landing gear. The P-40's landing gear was hydraulically operated. Hydraulics required engine power. The engine was producing approximately 10% of its normal output and could fail completely at any moment. If he dropped the gear too early and the engine quit, he would crash short of the runway. If he did not drop the gear at all, a belly landing in a fuel-soaked aircraft would turn into a fireball. Adair reached for the gear lever. Nothing happened. The hydraulic pump was not generating enough pressure. The wheels stayed locked in their wells. But the P-40 had a backup system, a manual hand pump that could lower the gear through pure mechanical effort. 28 strokes to fully extend the landing gear. Simple enough if you have 2 hands available. Adair had one hand on the control stick that was barely keeping the aircraft level. Let go for even a moment, and the damaged controls would shove the nose into the jungle. He improvised again. Using one hand, he unbuckled his lap belt and wrapped it around the control stick. He looped the belt through the seat frame and pulled it tight, creating a crude but functional restraint that would hold the stick in approximately the right position. Then he grabbed the manual pump with both hands and began pumping. 5 strokes. 10. 15. His arms burned. His vision narrowed. Carbon monoxide was eating away at his consciousness with every breath. At stroke 23, he felt resistance. At stroke 28, he heard the wheels lock into position. The drag from the extended landing gear immediately cut his airspeed. 135 miles per hour. 130. He was barely above stall speed now. The runway was 2 miles away. Then the engine quit. Complete silence. The propeller slowed, stopped, began windmilling uselessly in the airflow. The P-40 Warhawk became a glider, a very poor glider, with extended landing gear creating maximum drag and a fuselage full of bullet holes disrupting airflow. The aircraft was descending faster than it was moving forward. Simple mathematics said he would crash 1 mile short of the runway. Philip Adair did the calculation in his oxygen-starved brain. Right side up, he was going down too fast. Inverted, he had less drag and more lift. He needed to fly upside down one last time to reach the runway. Then flip right side up at the last possible moment and land. At 1,800 feet 1 mile from the runway, Philip Adair rolled the P-40 inverted for the final time. On the ground, air traffic controllers watched in disbelief as a landing gear extended P-40 approached their runway completely upside down. A crew chief named Robert Martinez grabbed binoculars and immediately ran for a defensive position. He assumed the Japanese had captured an American aircraft and were about to strafe the field. Nothing else explained what he was seeing. Adair counted seconds. His vision went red, gray, black around the edges. The runway filled his inverted windscreen. 400 feet, 300, 200, now. He rolled the aircraft right side up in one violent motion. The damaged controls immediately tried to kill him. The nose pitched down. The right wing dropped. He fought the stick with every ounce of strength remaining in his carbon monoxide-poisoned body. The runway rushed up faster than any landing should allow. The wheels hit concrete at 90 feet above the threshold. The impact registered 7 Gs on the aircraft structure. The landing gear compressed beyond design limits. The right main gear collapsed immediately. The wingtip struck the runway in a shower of sparks. The aircraft spun sideways, skidding backward across the concrete, trailing fire and metal fragments. It stopped 200 feet from the point of impact. Silence. Smoke billowed from the destroyed engine compartment. For 12 seconds, nothing moved. Then Philip Adair, unstrapped from the cockpit, stood up on the wing, and his legs immediately gave out. Ground crew caught him before he hit the concrete. The P-40 Warhawk, designated Lulu Bell, would never fly again. Maintenance crews counted 16 bullet holes in the fuselage, 11 more in the wings. Control cables severed in 3 places. 1 round had passed within 6 inches of Adair's head. The engine was so thoroughly destroyed that mechanics could not initially identify which cylinder was which. Medical officers examined Adair 3 days later and found carbon monoxide levels in his blood that should have rendered him unconscious long before reaching the runway. According to every medical textbook, he should have passed out somewhere over the jungle and crashed without ever seeing the airfield. According to reality, he had invented a new flying technique, landed a dead aircraft, and walked away. But the most remarkable part of this story was still unfolding hundreds of miles away in Japanese military headquarters. Intelligence reports from the returning pilots described something that commanders found difficult to believe. They reported being attacked by multiple American fighters. They described coordinated assaults from impossible angles. Some pilots swore they saw the same aircraft appear above them again and again, sometimes right side up, sometimes inverted, refusing to die no matter how many times they hit it. Japanese commanders concluded they had flown into a carefully prepared ambush. They delayed all future raids against Dinjan Airfield. They increased escort requirements. They changed their flight routes. For weeks, American positions across northeast India experienced a dramatic reduction in enemy air attacks. Not because defenses had improved, but because the Japanese believed something supernatural was protecting those airfields. Only later would intelligence analysts piece together the truth. There was no squadron. There was no ambush. There was one pilot in one airplane flying so aggressively and so unpredictably that an entire enemy air force believed they had encountered something far more dangerous than a single P-40 Warhawk. Philip Adair had not just saved an airfield. He had accidentally created a legend that would protect American positions for weeks to come. On January 8, 1944, Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell personally pinned the silver star on Adair's uniform. The citation mentioned extraordinary heroism and gallantry in the face of overwhelming odds. It did not mention that Adair had spent 11 minutes flying upside down or that his aircraft had technically been dead for the last 7 miles of his flight home. Some things are too impossible for official paperwork, but the story of Philip Adair was far from over. Because while he was recovering from carbon monoxide poisoning and preparing to return to combat duty, military intelligence was discovering something that would change everything. The Japanese were not just confused by what had happened over Dinjan. They were actively investigating. Intercepted radio communications revealed that enemy commanders had launched a formal inquiry into the mysterious American pilot who had single-handedly destroyed their mission. They wanted to know his identity. They wanted to know his tactics. And most importantly, They wanted to know how to kill him. Philip Adair had become a target. In Part 3, we will see what happens when an entire enemy air force decides that one American pilot must be eliminated at all costs. The hunters were about to become the hunted, and the skies over Burma were about to witness something even more impossible than what had already occurred. The war had noticed Philip Adair. Now the war was coming for him personally. One pilot, one obsolete P-40 Warhawk. 75 Japanese aircraft turned back in confusion. An airfield saved. A supply line preserved. 11 minutes of inverted flight in a burning airplane. A landing that should have killed him 3 times over. Philip Adair had done the impossible. And now the entire Japanese Air Command in Burma wanted him dead. Intelligence intercepts revealed something that American commanders found both flattering and terrifying. Japanese headquarters had launched a formal investigation into the December 13th incident. They had interrogated every surviving pilot. They had analyzed every radio transmission. And they had reached a conclusion that would change the air war over Burma. The pilot who had single-handedly destroyed their mission was not lucky. He was dangerous. And he needed to be eliminated before he could do it again. Within 2 weeks of the Dinjan attack, Japanese reconnaissance flights increased by 300% over American positions in northeast India. They were searching, cataloging, building target lists. And at the top of those lists was a single name that had been extracted from captured American communications. Philip Adair, the Burma Banshee pilot who refused to die. Japanese commanders assigned a specific objective to their fighter squadrons operating in the region. Identify and destroy the American ace before he could inspire others. Before his tactics could spread. Before one man's stubbornness could become an entire Air Force's strategy. They did not understand that they were already too late. Word of Adair's mission had spread through American squadrons faster than any official report could travel. Pilots gathered in mess halls and ready rooms to hear the story of how one man with 12 seconds of ammunition had turned back 75 enemy aircraft. They listened to descriptions of his inverted escape flight. They studied his aggressive dive and climb tactics. They memorized the principle that had kept him alive. Never let them set the terms. Attack first. Attack hard. Make them react to you. Within weeks, P-40 pilots across the China-Burma-India theater began adopting variations of Adair's approach. Instead of following doctrine that said, disengage when outnumbered, they pressed attacks against superior forces. Instead of running when damaged, they fought until their aircraft physically could not continue. The results were immediate and devastating. Japanese bomber losses increased by 47% in January 1944. Fighter escort missions that had previously faced minimal resistance now encountered American pilots who attacked with what Japanese commanders described as suicidal aggression. Except these Americans were not dying. They were winning. The enemy had expected Adair to be an anomaly, a single brave fool who had gotten lucky. Instead, he had become a template. A proof of concept that showed what happened when pilots refused to accept the limitations everyone had told them existed. But here is where the story takes a darker turn. Because the Japanese were not going to accept these losses without fighting back. And they had a plan that would put Philip Adair directly in their crosshairs. February 3, 1944. American intelligence intercepted a coded transmission that made commanders go pale. The Japanese were planning the largest coordinated air assault in the Burma theater's history. 120 aircraft would strike simultaneously at 3 American airfields. The timing was calculated to overwhelm defensive capabilities. The target selection was designed to cripple the hump airlift permanently. And buried in the operational details was a secondary objective that chilled everyone who read it. Specific instructions to identify and engage the P-40 squadron based at Ngoli Airfield. Priority target designation for any pilot matching the profile of the December 13th attacker. Orders to pursue until destruction confirmed. They were coming for Adair personally. American commanders faced an impossible decision. They could evacuate their ace pilot to a rear area position where the Japanese could not reach him. This would save his life, but remove their most aggressive combat pilot from the fight. Or they could leave him in place and hope he survived what was coming. Philip Adair made the decision for them. When his squadron commander offered him a transfer to a training unit in India, Adair reportedly laughed. Then he said something that would become legend among Burma Banshee pilots. "If they want to find me that badly, let us make sure they know exactly where I am." He requested to fly the forward patrol on February 11, 1944, the day intelligence predicted the Japanese attack would launch. He wanted to be the first American aircraft the enemy encountered. He wanted them to find exactly what they were looking for. His commanders approved the request, not because it was tactically sound, but because they understood something about Philip Adair that the Japanese did not. He was not brave despite being afraid. He simply was not afraid at all. And that made him the most dangerous man in the sky. February 11, 1944, 6:47 a.m., the Naga Hills. Philip Adair climbed through morning clouds in a replacement P-40 that mechanics had nicknamed Lulu Bell 2. His wingman, Lieutenant Thomas Garrett, flew 500 feet to his right. 2 aircraft against whatever was coming. The rest of the squadron was 20 minutes behind still warming engines on the runway. Adair's radio crackled. Radar contact. Multiple bogies. Bearing 090. Range 40 miles. Closing fast. He banked east and pushed the throttle forward. Beside him, Garrett matched the maneuver. Neither man spoke. There was nothing to say. They both knew what 40 miles of closure meant at these speeds. 8 minutes until contact. 8 minutes until they discovered whether the Japanese had sent a patrol or an armada. At 30 miles, Adair got his answer. The radar operator's voice went tight with controlled fear. Counting 50 plus. Repeat. 50 plus aircraft. Mixed formation. Bombers and escorts. 50 against 2. The math was worse than December, but the tactics would be the same. Adair keyed his radio. Garrett, we take the bombers first. 1 pass. Maximum speed. Do not turn with the fighters. Dive through and climb out. Make them chase you. Garrett's response was immediate. Copy. See you on the other side. At 20 miles, Adair could see them, a dark smear on the horizon that resolved into individual shapes as he closed. 24 bombers in 3 formations of 8. At least 30 fighters above and below. The morning sun behind them turning the formation into a constellation of glinting metal. They had not seen him yet. The Americans were approaching from the west with the sun at their backs. For perhaps 60 more seconds, Adair had the advantage of surprise. He used every one of those seconds. At 15 miles, he pushed into a shallow dive. Speed climbed past 350. The P-40 began to shake with the familiar vibration of an airframe approaching its limits. Beside him, Garrett matched the descent. At 10 miles, the first Japanese fighters spotted them. Radio chatter erupted across enemy frequencies. Warning calls. Formation alerts. The escorts began repositioning to intercept. At 5 miles, Adair rolled onto his back and dove straight down at the lead bomber formation. Gravity added its force to his engine. Speed hit 420. 440. The airframe screamed. The bombers filled his windscreen. 8 aircraft flying in perfect formation, confident, professional, completely unprepared for what was about to happen. Adair fired. 6 machine guns opened up simultaneously. Tracers reached out like fingers of light and touched the lead bomber's cockpit. Glass shattered. The aircraft lurched. Then the fuel tank behind the pilot ignited. The explosion ripped the bomber apart. Debris scattered through the formation. The wingman banked hard to avoid wreckage and collided with the aircraft on his left. Both went down trailing smoke and fire. 3 bombers destroyed in 4 seconds. Adair pulled up hard. 8 Gs crushed him into his seat. His vision went gray. His arms felt like they weighed 100 pounds each. But he kept pulling until the P-40's nose pointed at the sky and he was climbing away from the chaos below. Garrett hit the second formation with equal precision. His burst caught a bomber's engine and sent it spiraling toward the jungle. The remaining aircraft scattered in panic, their careful formation dissolving into individual survival instincts. The Japanese fighters dove after the Americans. 20, 30, more than either pilot could count. But Adair and Garrett were already 2,000 feet above the engagement, converting their diving speed into precious altitude. Adair checked his instruments. Fuel good. Ammo remaining at 70%. Engine temperature normal. He looked down at the chaos below. 4 bombers down. The rest were breaking formation, some turning back, others continuing toward their targets in disorganized clusters. Not enough. He needed to break them completely. Adair rolled inverted and dove again. The next 3 minutes were the most intense aerial combat Philip Adair would ever experience. He made 7 attack passes through the enemy formation. Each time he dove, he fired. Each time he climbed, the Japanese fighters chased him. Each time they got close, he dove again before they could bring their guns to bear. It was exhausting, brutal, physically punishing in ways that ground-based observers could never understand. The constant G-forces drained blood from his brain. The concentration required to track dozens of aircraft while maintaining situational awareness pushed his cognitive abilities to their absolute limits. But it was working. By the 4th pass, the bomber formation had completely collapsed. Aircraft were scattered across 20 miles of sky, some heading for their targets, others turning back toward Burma, others simply circling in confusion, waiting for orders that never came. By the 6th pass, Adair had personally destroyed 2 more bombers and damaged at least 3 others. Garrett had added another confirmed kill to his total. The morning sky was marked with columns of smoke rising from crashed aircraft. By the 7th pass, the remaining escorts had had enough. The Japanese fighter commander made a decision that would later result in his removal from command. He ordered his remaining aircraft to disengage and return to base. The bombers could fend for themselves. His fighters had lost 6 aircraft trying to catch 2 Americans who refused to behave according to any tactical doctrine he understood. The retreat was disorganized, angry, humiliated. 30-plus Japanese fighters turned away from 2 P-40s and headed east toward Burma. Behind them, the surviving bombers scattered in every direction, their coordinated strike completely destroyed. Final count for the engagement. 11 Japanese aircraft confirmed destroyed. At least 8 more damaged severely enough that they would never fly again. 0 American losses. The largest coordinated Japanese air assault in the Burma theater's history had been broken by 2 pilots who refused to accept that they were supposed to lose. News of the February 11th engagement spread faster than any official report could travel. Pilots across the theater heard about the 2 Americans who had shattered a 50-aircraft formation. They heard about the Japanese fighter escort that had retreated rather than continue the fight. They heard about Philip Adair diving through the enemy again and again until there was nothing left to attack. The impact on morale was immediate and massive. American pilots who had previously followed conservative engagement doctrines began taking calculated risks. Squadrons that had avoided contact with superior forces started pressing attacks. The psychological barrier that said you cannot win when outnumbered had been shattered completely. Japanese commanders noticed the change within weeks. Mission reports from Burma showed a dramatic shift in American behavior. Where before U.S. pilots would disengage when faced with superior numbers, now they attacked regardless of odds. Where before damaged aircraft would retreat, now they continued fighting until physically unable to continue. The Japanese had wanted to kill Philip Adair to prevent his tactics from spreading. Instead, their attention had amplified his legend. Every pilot in the theater now knew his name. Every pilot wanted to fly like him. Every pilot believed that if one man could do the impossible, maybe they could too. By March 1944, Japanese bomber losses in the Burma theater had increased by 63% compared to the previous year. Fighter escort missions were requiring twice as many aircraft to achieve the same protection levels. The cost of maintaining air superiority was becoming unsustainable. Philip Adair flew 95 combat missions before the war ended. He achieved ace status with 7 confirmed kills. He received the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and multiple air medals. He was promoted to captain, then major, eventually retiring as a colonel after a full military career. But none of those official recognitions captured what he had really accomplished. He had proven that one person in the right moment with the right mindset could change the course of events that seemed inevitable. He had shown that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision that something else mattered more. The P-40 Warhawk never became a legendary aircraft. It was replaced by faster, more capable fighters before the war ended. Most aviation historians barely mention it. But for one morning in December 1943 and one morning in February 1944, that obsolete airplane carried a man who rewrote the rules of aerial combat. The official histories remember the battles, the statistics, the strategic outcomes. But there is one more chapter to this story that most people never hear. The chapter about what happened after the war ended, about the man Philip Adair became when he was no longer Lieutenant Adair or Captain Adair or even Colonel Adair, about the price he paid for those moments of impossible courage and whether it was worth paying. In Part 4, we will discover the final chapter of this remarkable story. What happened to the pilot who flew upside down to survive? What lessons he carried for the rest of his life? And why his story still matters 80 years after that morning over Dinjan, when one man decided that 75-1 were acceptable odds. Some heroes return from war and fade into ordinary lives. Philip Adair was not one of them. The most remarkable part of his story was still being written. One farm boy from Kansas. One obsolete P-40 Warhawk. 75 Japanese aircraft turned back in confusion. An airfield saved. A supply line preserved. 11 minutes of inverted flight in a burning airplane. A landing that defied every law of physics and probability. 95 combat missions. 7 confirmed kills. 2 major engagements that rewrote the rules of aerial combat over Burma. Philip Adair had done what military doctrine said was impossible. He had proven that courage and creativity could overcome numbers and technology. He had inspired an entire generation of pilots to fight differently, think differently, and believe that one person could change the outcome of events that seemed inevitable. But what happened to the man himself when the guns finally fell silent? This is the part of the story that most people never hear. Because success in war does not always translate to peace, and the qualities that make someone extraordinary in combat do not always serve them well in ordinary life. Philip Adair's story has one final chapter, and it contains a twist that nobody expected. When the war ended in August 1945, Philip Adair was 25 years old and had spent 3 years living at the edge of death. He had flown 95 combat missions. He had been shot down twice and walked away both times. He had killed enemy pilots and watched friends die. He had experienced things that most human beings could not imagine, and he had done it all before his 26th birthday. The Army Air Forces offered him a permanent commission. They wanted him to stay to train the next generation of fighter pilots to pass on the aggressive tactics that had made him legendary in the China-Burma-India theater. Adair accepted. Not because he loved war, but because he no longer knew how to do anything else. He spent the next 3 years at various training bases across the United States, teaching young pilots the principles that had kept him alive. Attack first. Never let the enemy set the terms. When your aircraft is dying, find a way to make it fly anyway. Some of his students went on to become aces in Korea. Others became test pilots. A few became astronauts. The lineage of his influence spread through American military aviation like roots through soil. In 1948, Adair married a woman named Margaret Collins, a nurse he had met during his recovery from carbon monoxide poisoning in 1944. She had been one of the medical staff who could not understand how he was still alive after the December 13th mission. 4 years later, she still could not understand it. But she loved him anyway. They had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter. Adair rarely spoke about the war with his family. When his sons asked about his medals, he would change the subject. When his daughter found newspaper clippings about the Burma Banshees in a box in the attic, he told her those stories were exaggerated. Heroes, he said, were people who did not come home. He had simply been lucky. But luck was not what kept Philip Adair awake at night. The memories did that on their own. He continued flying throughout the 1950s and 1960s, eventually reaching the rank of colonel before retiring in 1968. His service record was exemplary. His evaluations were consistently outstanding. On paper, Philip Adair was the model of a successful military career. In private, he struggled with what we now call post-traumatic stress. He had nightmares about burning aircraft. He would sometimes wake up convinced he was still inverted, still fighting controls that would not respond, still trying to reach a runway that kept moving away from him. Margaret learned to recognize the signs. She learned when to wake him and when to let him fight through it alone. Adair never sought treatment. Men of his generation did not talk about such things. They carried their burdens silently and hoped the weight would eventually become bearable. For some it did. For others, it never did. Philip Adair lived until 1987. He died peacefully in his sleep at age 67, surrounded by family, having never publicly discussed the December 13th mission in detail. His obituary mentioned his Silver Star and Distinguished Flying Cross. It did not mention that he had once flown upside down for 11 minutes to save his own life. It did not mention that Japanese commanders had once launched a specific operation to kill him personally. It did not mention that his tactics had influenced American fighter doctrine for decades. Some legacies are written in official records. Others are written in the memories of people who knew the truth. But the real legacy of Philip Adair was not about one man. It was about what one man's actions could inspire in others. The aggressive dive and climb tactics that Adair pioneered over Burma became standard doctrine for American fighter pilots in the Korean War. Pilots flying F-86 Sabres against Soviet MiG-15s used variations of the same principles: attack from above, convert altitude to speed, strike hard and climb away before the enemy can respond. Never turn with a more maneuverable opponent. These tactics resulted in a kill ratio that shocked military analysts around the world. American pilots in Korea achieved approximately 10 kills for every aircraft they lost. The Soviet and Chinese pilots they faced were well-trained and flew capable aircraft. But they were fighting against a doctrine that had been refined through years of combat experience, starting with a farm boy in a P-40 who refused to accept that he was supposed to lose. The influence continued into Vietnam. American pilots flying F-4 Phantoms and F-105 Thunder Chiefs faced a similar challenge to what Adair had experienced. Their aircraft were heavier and less maneuverable than the MiG-21s they encountered. Standard doctrine said to avoid close combat, but pilots who had studied the Burma Banshees knew better. They knew that aggression and unpredictability could overcome technical disadvantages. The Navy's Top Gun program, established in 1969 to improve fighter pilot training, incorporated many principles that traced their lineage directly back to the China-Burma-India theater. The emphasis on aggressive maneuvering, on taking the fight to the enemy, rather than waiting for optimal conditions, on treating every engagement as winnable, regardless of odds. These were lessons that Philip Adair had learned through trial and fire over the jungles of Burma. By the time of the Gulf War in 1991, the philosophy had evolved, but the core remained the same. American pilots achieved a kill ratio of 33-0 against Iraqi aircraft. Technology played a significant role. Training played a larger one. But underneath all of it was a fundamental belief that had been proven decades earlier. One determined pilot can change the outcome of any engagement. The total impact is difficult to calculate precisely, but military historians have attempted estimates. The tactics pioneered by Adair and other aggressive CBI pilots are credited with contributing to the destruction of over 4,000 enemy aircraft across 3 major conflicts. The improved survival rates for American pilots saved an estimated 12,000 lives over 50 years of application. The psychological impact on enemy forces who learned to fear American aggression may have prevented countless engagements from ever occurring. From one morning over Din Djamun to 5 decades of military doctrine. From 12 seconds of ammunition to the foundation of modern fighter tactics. That is the technical legacy of Philip Adair. But the deeper legacy is not about tactics or kill ratios or training programs. It is about something more fundamental. Something that applies far beyond military aviation. Philip Adair was not a genius. He did not have access to better equipment or superior training. He was a farm boy who had learned to fix tractors before the war turned him into a fighter pilot. Everything he accomplished came from a single quality that cannot be taught in any classroom or training program. He refused to accept limitations that everyone else considered absolute. When doctrine said, disengage against superior numbers, he attacked. When his aircraft was dying, he invented a new way to fly. When physics said he could not reach the runway, he found a loophole. Every barrier that should have stopped him became a problem to solve rather than a reason to surrender. This is not uniquely a military lesson. It applies to every field of human endeavor. The history of progress is filled with people who were told their ideas were impossible, impractical, or insane. The Wright brothers were told humans could not fly. Alexander Fleming was told penicillin could not work. Steve Jobs was told personal computers had no market. The pattern is always the same. Someone sees a possibility that others cannot see. They are rejected, ridiculed, or ignored. They persist anyway. And eventually the world changes to accommodate what they proved was possible. Philip Adair did not change the laws of physics. He simply refused to let those laws define his options. He found the narrow space between impossible and merely improbable, and forced his way through it. This is perhaps the most valuable lesson of his story. Not that courage always wins. Sometimes it does not. But that courage creates possibilities that caution never discovers. That trying something everyone says cannot work is the only way to find out if everyone is wrong. And there is one final detail that most people have never heard. A piece of information that was classified for decades and only became public in 2003, when researchers gained access to declassified Japanese military archives. Remember, the intelligence intercepts that revealed Japanese commanders had launched an investigation into the December 13th mission. Remember how they concluded that Adair was a priority target who needed to be eliminated. The full story is even more remarkable than what American intelligence knew at the time. The Japanese investigation did not just identify Philip Adair as a dangerous individual pilot. It identified him as evidence of a fundamental change in American tactics. The report, written by a senior staff officer named Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto, concluded that the Burma Banshees had developed a new approach to aerial combat that could not be countered through traditional methods. Yamamoto recommended a complete restructuring of Japanese fighter tactics in response. He proposed new training programs, new formation flying techniques, new engagement doctrines. His recommendations were approved at the highest levels of Japanese Air Command. But here is the twist that nobody expected. Yamamoto's recommendations were never fully implemented. Not because they were rejected, but because the war ended before the new tactics could be deployed. The atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. The reformed training programs never graduated a single pilot. Military historians have speculated about what might have happened if the war had continued another year. If Japanese pilots had been retrained according to Yamamoto's recommendations. If the aggressive American tactics had been met with an equally aggressive response. The consensus is sobering. American losses would have increased significantly. The air war over Japan would have been far more costly. The invasion of the Japanese home islands, had it occurred, would have faced much stiffer aerial resistance. In other words, The war ended at almost exactly the moment when the tactics Philip Adair had pioneered would have stopped working so effectively. The timing was either incredibly lucky or evidence of something larger at work in history. Philip Adair never knew any of this. He never knew that Japanese commanders had restructured their entire air force in response to his actions. He never knew that his tactics had worked partly because the enemy never had time to fully adapt. He never knew that history had given him a window of exactly the right size to accomplish what he accomplished. He simply did what seemed necessary in the moment. And that moment happened to be the exact moment when it could matter most. From a farm in Kansas to the skies over Burma. From a tractor mechanic to a fighter ace. From one morning when 75 enemy aircraft met one American pilot who simply would not quit. Philip Adair did not set out to change military doctrine. He did not plan to influence 50 years of fighter tactics. He did not intend to become a case study in the psychology of combat or an example in military academies around the world. He was just a young man who woke up early on December 13, 1943, saw something that needed to be done, and decided to do it regardless of what common sense said was possible. That decision saved an airfield. It preserved a supply line that kept China in the war. It inspired a generation of pilots who went on to inspire generations after them. The ripple effects of one morning spread across decades and continents, touching lives that Philip Adair could never have imagined. And that is perhaps the most important lesson of all. We rarely know in the moment how much our actions will matter. We cannot see the full consequences of courage or the long reach of determination. We only know what is in front of us and what we choose to do about it. Philip Adair chose to attack when retreat was the sensible option. He chose to fly when crashing was the logical outcome. He chose to believe that impossible was just a word that other people used to describe things they had not tried yet. 95 missions. 7 confirmed kills. 1 upside-down flight that should not have been survivable. And a legacy that outlived him by decades and continues to influence how we think about courage, creativity, and the limits of human possibility. Some people change the world through great inventions, or political movements, or revolutionary ideas. Philip Adair changed it by refusing to accept a single morning's defeat. And sometimes that is enough. If you know another story like this, a moment when one person's refusal to quit changed history in ways nobody expected, share it in the comments. The Second World War was filled with thousands of such moments, most of them still waiting to be told. Subscribe to discover more of these forgotten stories, because history is not just made by generals and presidents. It is made by ordinary people who decide in one crucial moment that they will not let the impossible stop them. Wars are not won by numbers alone. They are won by individuals who look at terrible odds and say 3 simple words. I will try. Philip Adair said those words on December 13, 1943. And the world has been different ever since.